Nigeria's foreign trade deficit widened to a record 1.9 trillion naira in 2021 as cost of importing commodities exceeded the value of the country's exports, according to official data from the Bureau of Statistics. The country imported about 20.8 trillion naira worth of goods in 2021, 64% higher than the 12.7 trillion recorded in the prior year. And you can see exports are at 18.9 trillion, giving you a deficit of 1.94 trillion. Then Nigeria's consumer price index rose to 15.7% in February from 15.6% in January, according to the latest figures from the Bureau of Statistics. That's year on year. NBS disclosed this in its Consumer Price Index February 2022 report. According to the NBS, the Bureau of Statistics, the highest increases were recorded in prices of gas, liquid fuel, wine, tobacco, spirits, solid fuels, among others. Mayowa Ige, analyst with Financial Derivatives Company Limited, joins us now to discuss further. Mayowa, you're very welcome. Good afternoon to you. We apparently, if we look at the trade data, we imported about 1.9 trillion of agri products in 2021. We've got a lot of intervention schemes that have been put in agri sector. You've seen, and this is something I'm going to ask you. Food inflation decelerated, I think, to 17.1%. You put all this together. Why is that? How do you make sense of that?
Well, hello, Rosis. Thank you for having me, first of all. Well, you look at it, right? In the same period, we actually saw exports increase by about 42% or so. But the problem is that we look at it with all the interventions, we've actually increased our local production. However, it's not been sufficient to meet local demand, right? And then when you're not meeting local demand, how do you expect to meet your export? How do you expect to export goods that are not even enough for the people on ground? It's not people that are eating that would even start doing all those kind of things, right? And so the interventions from the federal government have been a step in the right direction, but they have been good. But the issue with them has been primarily one, when we look at the administration, the monitoring of these interventions, right? It's one thing to come up with a plan and strategy, but execution is key, and that's been missing with all these interventions. Are they getting to the right people? Then leakages, corruption, and all of that. Number two, insecurity is a huge issue in this country. There's insecurity in the food producing part of the country, and that has been affecting even the level of production that we see. We had investment in rice, in wheat. However, we're still producing 1% of the local demand of wheat. For instance, we're spending $2 billion on wheat importation. Even though production has grown significantly, they're still smuggling, and that's still helping to cushion the effect on the price of rice. Price of rice has not declined significantly, even with this increase in production. And so this is as a result of these issues. There are still fundamental issues such as poor infrastructure. We have most of our farmers are local farmers. They have poor mechanization, poor farming techniques, poor input, because the computer language, garbage in, garbage out, all of this. So these are some of the issues that have been plaguing the agricultural sector and affecting our production and also our exports, and making our import bill as high as 1.9 trillion naira.
So what's the, thanks for that, what's the role, I guess, of government in trying to temper down those prices?
Well, the government has its role in it, right? I think number one, we look at research and development. That is a very huge part of it, right? Before we even come to the financing and all of that, what is going into the ground? What's the quality of the soil, for instance? So is research and development first. I think that's the first thing that the government has to look at. We have research institutes. We have the IITA, Cocoa Research Institute, and all of that. If you look at the 80s, the 90s, we had the Agri Extension officers that were doing a lot of these things, and we have not been really doing a lot of that in recent times. So I think that some of these interventions, the government needs to focus on that aspect, right? Because you say we have the Dangote refinery with fertilizer. Do we even know the quality of the soil in different parts of Nigeria? Our fertilizer usage per hectare is one of the lowest in the world. Our yield per hectare is one of the lowest in the world. Then when we talk of research, there's also coming up with quality seedlings, hybrid seedlings that can produce the right output that will give us the desired outcome, right? That's one aspect of it. Then infrastructure, looking at the roads, looking at power, they actually affect the agri sector and looking at insecurity, the government, if it's insecurity, I mean, that is a huge problem with this space. The government has to solve that. And then when you look at it, maybe they can't totally solve that, but maybe we need to start looking at other parts of the country that are not so plagued by insecurity. I mean, technology is the value chain aspect of it, using agri-tech. We can go into different other parts of the country and improve the soil, the irrigation, all of these things. So we don't have to rely on only one part of the country where insecurity is at its peak.
I want to touch on agri-tech. Tech it's something that's been rising in different circles as far as conversation is concerned. What are the innovations there that can possibly also, again, temper down food prices?
Well, agri-tech, there are a lot of innovations there right now, right? It's where the world is looking at. And then, for instance, in Nigeria, we're looking at it. We have Agro, I think Agro Exchange. We have FX Comex that provides a platform for investors to trade commodities. We have Farm Crowdy.
Crowdy is a nice name too.
Producing, taking care of the supply chain. Agro Exchange is connecting farmers to customers, investors, using a smart identification number. We have all these things, right? There's a huge potential for these companies, these agri-tech companies, to come into this space and improve the value chain in terms of storage, processing, and even logistics. There's even one very interesting one. I can't remember the name of the company, but I saw it randomly, that they provide storage facilities in markets, I think in the East, where sellers in the market can store their agri commodities to prevent wastages. When we look at agri, most of our, I think 45% of our production ends up being wasted. Storage is a huge problem. So there are parts that these agri-tech companies can actually solve and help to boost agri production in Nigeria.
Okay, so that's great, but I do want to, earlier we announced the news that the SEC had folded up 3 companies in Lagos, Port Harcourt, and the FCT. I think 1 or 2 of them are agri-tech, agro-allied companies. So, I guess on the brand side, what do you make of that? Because that can't be good for the whole, reputation for the sector when you've got things like that, companies like that being closed off.
Well, when you look at it, SEC closed them off, right, not because of the issues in the agri space. It was because they were engaging in activities, fund management activities, without having the required registration. We look at it, this same thing. SEC also put a sanction, I think, on CBN on rice, vest, chaka, bamboo at some point.
Right, at some point, yeah.
That's a regulatory issue. But then if we actually look at the agri-tech space in the past 2 years, there's been a lot of issues with payment defaults, Trive-Agric and the likes, right? And then most of these companies mentioned that it was due to COVID-19 pandemic affecting farming yields, production yields, and all of that. But I think that all these things have just shown is the current issue with business models of these agri-tech companies, right? But this is not something that I don't think it's something that would cast a bad light on the space as a whole. I think the government has a part to play in it. SEC has a part to play in it. I know that they started working on it, as they started coming up with revised guidelines for crowdfunding, but there's still much to be done. Corporate governance would go a long way in actually solving the business model issues that these companies have. So if SEC comes into the place, regulates the space, right, it would actually go a long way, because they have to actually do something about it, because the future is agri-tech. The world is expecting the global agri-tech sector to grow to about $200 billion. So Nigeria cannot be left behind in this. So the government has to step in and regulate that space so we can achieve desired outcomes from it. So
can Nigeria boost, or rather diversify its revenue base on that promise that there'll be a boost in agri-tech?
Yes, it's possible. Yes, they can. However, like I said, the government has to do its own part, right? If the government has to pay attention to infrastructure and all of these things, if the government does its part, then agri-tech can actually help in boosting our revenues from export from that.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think the sector growing to 200 billion. That number is significant because that's the same figure that the CBN is targeting, the RT 200, to raise 200 billion in non-oil exports over the next 3 to 5 years. Well, what do you make of that plan?
Well, as with the government, the government interventions and all of this, like I said, it still boils down to the implementation of all these their schemes. It's a step in the right direction, right? But are we channeling it to the right people? I mean, some of these interventions, are they going to go to these agri-tech companies to help boost their own operations and all of this? So I think the government, this is a step in the right direction, but the government has to focus on monitoring to block leakages, and also the government has to do other parts such as infrastructure. They can't do it alone. I mean, they can still partner with the private sector, public-private partnerships, give tax rebates to companies to do the roads, power, and all of those things to boost, to help these agri companies to create an easy environment for doing business for them.
Just a minute ago, what other countries are doing everything you've talked about right now?
Well, the UK, for instance, they invested about £24 million in the agri-tech space. China has recently said that they do not want to rely on other countries for food security. So recently, they actually gave online training courses to about 800,000 farmers. 800,000 farmers in order for them to boost their agri-tech services. The US, California is becoming the hub for agri-tech services. So I think developed nations are tapping into this sector and using it to boost their own production and have food sustainability for themselves.
Mayowa Ige of Financial Derivatives Company Limited, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your insights on agri-tech.